Hey everybody, KMO here. It's another live stream from the studios of Falls Area Community Television, otherwise known as Fact TV. It's kind of like ATM machine. And tonight it's not just me jabbering at you, so you can count your blessings. I have an in-studio guest, Liam.
Hi.
Liam Madden. I just read your Wikipedia entry today. I've known you for a long time. I didn't know you had a Wikipedia entry.
You didn't even actually expect it was going to be the Liam Madden that you knew.
Exactly. So you served in the Marine Corps.
Yep.
And you've been to Iraq and many other places in the service of your country. Yet at the same time, you were advocating for peace in uniform.
Yeah, that was a wild ride for sure.
Yeah, and that's why you have a Wikipedia page.
Yeah.
After you were out, I believe the Defense Department investigated you.
Yeah.
What was that about?
That's actually kind of a funny story. The day, it was probably like 2 weeks, I don't know, a month out of having been honorably discharged, getting on with my life. I got 2 letters in the mail from the Defense Department the same day. And one was trying to get me to re-enlist. And the other was trying to remove my honorable discharge for my activities.
Wow.
But yeah, they were not happy with how vocal I was about thinking. I started a petition to Congress to get other Marines and soldiers and sailors to basically the only right you have to protest while in the military is to write your congressman. So I just basically tried to consolidate and aggregate as many of those individual letters to Congress from service members that I could.
And from the perspective of at least somebody in our U.S. military, that was an unwholesome activity.
Well, the thing that they had a problem with was on, I think it was like the last day I was in the military. You're on this thing called terminal leave, which means you just use up all your leave days. So I actually hadn't been on a military base for several weeks.
Right.
But the last day on my contract, there was a photo of me at a protest in Washington, D.C., and I had my fatigue jacket on, which is technically protesting in uniform. And they didn't like that. That's actually against the rules. It's by no means enough to get you dishonorably discharged or anything like that. But I wrote a letter back to them saying, I don't know. It was basically if you can prove to me this war was legal, then I'll happily just comply with all these demands you had. And I never got a letter back, and I ended up dropping the charges.
Did you ever read the book The Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul?
No, that's a good title.
It's by Douglas Adams. He's better known for writing The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and it's the second in his Dirk Gently holistic detective novels. At one point, Dirk Gently has come back to his flat or his apartment for the first time in a long time, and he's looking through his mail, and he's got 2 letters from American Express, one telling him that his American Express card has been canceled, and another inviting him to apply for an American Express card.
Yeah, can relate.
Yeah. So now, here you are in Vermont. You are still active toward, an activist, I guess you could say. And you brought those. Maybe you talk about your chickens and then what you do. I mean, how would you define yourself in terms of this conversation?
I'm not at liberty to be telling you that, Camo.
Yeah.
No, I just have a backyard flock of chickens, but my wife has this pretty successful following on social media for making fancy organic hippie herbal products and face care and medicines and stuff like that. So the eggs actually get used in some of our stuff, but I just like to have some gifts to bring to people when I'm out and about. So
those are
that's
great
how
gifts.
Ended up here. Yeah, happy chickens for sure.
Looking at the color of the shells, I'm guessing there's some Rhode Island Reds in the flock?
There's no Rhode Island. It's
Really?
the one thing we don't have.
Okay, how about some Aracanas?
Definitely an Araucana. I could bore you.
That'd be the blue one.
Yeah, for sure. That's a Hamburg.
All right. That I would not have guessed.
That's tough.
Well.
But you flexed your chicken breed muscle pretty well, though, so no need to go too fancy.
So how about energy? Energy issues.
Oh, yeah. So I had a nonprofit for a while called Green Gas. It's actually still running. I'm just not that involved in it anymore. And it's kind of driven out of my reverse engineering of why were we in the Iraq War. Mm-hmm. It's not just as simple as bad leaders. I think there's just some bigger geopolitical forces at work, and it doesn't take too much detective work to get to the energy issue. So I've always been really interested in that. Not to mention that I think climate change is a pretty urgent, dire civilization scale threat. Wanted to be involved in what felt like the cause closest to my heart. And we started a project to try and get gas companies to pay for climate change, but it's tougher sell than you think. So we're only in around like 40 different gas stations, and it just wasn't growing fast enough to really be like a full-time endeavor. But it still operates, it still gets some traffic.
So now that we've established that you're not just an anti-mask crank.
Okay, that's the point. Sure, yeah.
Let's
I'm
move
a bona fide do-gooder.
Yes. Sure. Let's move on to your recent open letter that you sent to a variety of people, including 4 elected representatives here. Not all representatives in the technical sense, but elected officials to the Vermont Legislator, and also some other folks who might have been interested, including me. And well, I'd like to just have you read that out. We'll talk. Yeah,
I didn't actually get to the point of opening that email. If you could just give me one moment, I'm sure I can find it.
Well, then I'm going to take that one moment to say I'm looking at the chat now, and there's nothing here. So, folks, be prepared to ask questions. Type. And in the meantime, I'll say that the Geb webcomic is now a print comic, and it is available for Kindle, and it is also available on Comixology, both of which you can get to through Amazon. So do a test. Just try an experiment. Go to Amazon and type in Geb. It's Gebb, or for you military folks, Golf Echo Bravo Bravo, and see if you see the first issue there. And we could really use some glowing 5-star reviews, but even if there's no glowing 5-star reviews saying, oh my God, this thing is such trash, I can't believe anybody would bother with this. No press is bad press. Tell us how offended you were at it. That would be awesome. Alrighty, and while Liam is looking for his email, I'm gonna, and here's one from Jeanette White coming in late. So, I'm reading this for the first time. This is from Jeanette White. She's a senator or representative?
I believe she's a state senator.
Yeah, and she writes, thank you, I'm unable to attend this meeting. I'll confirm that. I do not agree with Liam about the reports. You know what? Let me have you read yours first.
Sure.
We'll come back to Senator White. All right.
It's loading up. Okay. Here we go. Dear legislators, as you may have heard, what the heck? That's not actually how it started. It's just jumping around on the screen, folks. Sorry for my clumsiness, I guess. Dear legislators, as you may have heard, the CDC has recently released a report, this was linked, on the effectiveness of masks. 1%. That's right, mask mandates have contributed a 1% risk reduction in the spread and impact of COVID-19, according to the CDC. Even if this 1% or so merits scrutiny, merits scrutiny given likelihood that confounding factors may have not been accounted for. This supports the conclusions of the Danish study, which was published in the Annals of Internal Medicine in May of 2020, which indicated that masks confer a staggeringly disappointing 0.3 statistically insignificant reduction in risk for mask users. And of course, the entire history of studies on masks prior to 2020, which indicated that they were not able to demonstrate a statistically significant impact on the transmission of viruses in a community setting, which is why no one batted an eye when Tony Fauci initially advised that exact point in April 2020. This recent clarification in mask effectiveness, in conjunction with the fact that the case numbers have been overwhelmingly inflated, 90 to 97% by PCR tests administered with inappropriate cycle thresholds. A fact reported in both the New York Times, which said it was 90% plus, and the Journal of Clinical Infectious Diseases, which had it as high as 97%. I ask that you initiate and support immediate legislation to lift Vermont's mask mandate and require the appropriate regulation of PCR test cycle thresholds. If a 95% overstating of the impact of COVID-19 and a roughly 1% effectiveness of the response does not warrant an immediate realization of error and an impulse to correct that error, then what does? Please advise how you will respond to this request. Oh, and by the way, according to the same CDC study, you can probably salvage what is left of the restaurant industry by removing restriction on them as well, given they've also netted a measly 1% risk reduction. Respectfully, Liam Madden. That's what I said.
All right, so to sum up, masks, they're basically a magical incantation, or it's a signal that we send to one another saying, look, I'm participating in the the anti-COVID gestures, but they don't do a whole lot. And this is unfortunate, but they're a culture war touchstone now.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
It's really unfortunate that is the case, but I'm personally more concerned about the people who have had to stop working, because their place of business, they can't operate under the current conditions. And so lots of people are way behind on their rent. Lots of people have suffered economic injury that will take them years, if not decades, to fully recover from. And there's just no telling what the psychological damage is of not ever seeing human faces except on a screen.
Yeah.
All the real human faces that you see out in the world, they're behind a veil. I hate that. And, I just hate the masks just because they cause my glasses to fog up. And when I go to the only time I ever wear the mask really is when I go to the grocery store. I go to Levi's here in Bellows Falls. And I've noticed that people that I used to say hello to and stop and talk to, if we're both masked, we can pretend we don't recognize each other and we just pass in the store without any comment. Mm-hmm. There is a definite psychological effect at work. And again, it's like the economic damage. We don't know what the long-term effects of that are going to be. Now, I'm 52. I'm pretty much set in my ways and I'm not changing psychologically that much. But what about 15-year-olds? Mm-hmm. What about 8-year-olds?
2-year-olds.
2-year-olds. Yeah. I mean, what does a year without seeing, a wide variety of human faces do to them psychologically? And it's not a rhetorical question. I don't know.
Right. Or learning to speak. I mean, that's another one for...
Yeah, you look at people's mouths and
absolutely.
You pair it with the words.
And then on top of that, I think it sends a subconscious gesture that other humans are dangerous to someone that young, right? Why is this person not presenting their face to me? I do want to comment that I think I misinterpreted this 1%, which is a artifact of that the way they measured the 1% effect of masks was by the growth rate of spread, and I interpreted the growth rate not to be the. I guess I'm getting into the minutia here, but it makes a difference. The 1% in growth rate does have a much larger impact down the road on the actual number of cases. And I was quick to point out that error, but I'm so glad I made it because it revealed to me that even if it was as negligible of an impact as 1%, if I didn't make the error, I never would have known that even telling people it was only 1% wouldn't shift their positions. They were invested in the idea that 1% is totally enough to justify any sort of psychological or economic or environmental impact that my masks might have, no matter how negligible the actual effect it was having on the disease, which staggered me. So I still think that despite my error, the impact of masks is negligible. or it's worthy of having a conversation to see if the impacts and benefits are really proportionate to each other.
Mm-hmm.
But we've never really had an opportunity to have that conversation because people who have any inclination to question the effectiveness of masks are kind of immediately labeled as outcasts or pariahs or as selfish or anti-scientific, and that's pretty troubling.
So I've laid my cards on the table. I mean, I don't like the masks. I'm very dissatisfied with particularly the federal response to the coronavirus. I mean, their first instinct was, as always, never let a good crisis go to waste. The first opportunity they had, massive transfer of wealth to the top.
Right.
It's their only, I mean, it's just like a knee-jerk reflex. It's like, oh, something has gone wrong. Something big has happened, and we have this moment of opportunity. Let's transfer as much wealth to the top as we can in this moment. So, anyway, mine is not the majority position. So let's check in. I mentioned just as we were talking, Senator Jeanette White wrote in. She says, "I do not agree with Liam about the reports and the efficacy of masks. My understanding from reading the reports is that masks alone do not solve the problem, but when used with other precautions, distancing, hand washing, etc., masks are very effective. We simply disagree on the interpretation of the reports." Jeanette. And this is from Carolyn Partridge. And Colin, if you can, put up Carolyn Partridge's message, part 1. She writes, "I've been following the email conversation with interest, but have not had the time to verify the claims made about the CDC, etc. I have been adhering to the directives of the Scott administration." And for those of you not in Vermont, that is Phil Scott, our governor, Republican governor, which is an odd thing for Vermont, but there it is.
It's not that odd for Vermont.
It's odd for...
It's counterintuitive for people not in Vermont.
Exactly, yes. So, I've been adhering to the directives of the Scott administration, have been fortunate to not have contracted COVID-19, and on April 5th, I will be getting my second dose of the vaccine. Our family has been touched by the pandemic in that my daughter-in-law's father died at the age of 68 in New Jersey on December 1st, 2020 of COVID-19. It seems to me that when the precautionary directives are not followed, there tend to be outbreaks. Whether it's due to people not wearing masks, washing their hands, or keeping a safe distance, it's hard to tell. But I choose to follow the directives when I am out and about. Additionally, for the sake of others, after I have been fully vaccinated and considered immune, I will continue to wear a mask. It's a small thing I can do to possibly avoid the heartbreak and tragedy that we, and especially my daughter-in-law, son, and grandchildren have experienced as a result of the loss of their beloved G-Paw. Feel free to read this if it is helpful to the conversation. Take good care and stay safe, Carolyn." So I know you had a chance to read that before just now. What are your thoughts there?
I sympathize with having lost a loved one. I don't think COVID-19 is non-existent. I don't think I think it is dangerous for certain segments of the population, and precautions should be taken to protect them. As a human, that's my response. As a constituent of that politician, I hear that as, I followed all the rules, and I'm not willing to question if those rules are based on sound judgments. And that's disappointing.
Okay. We have a clip now from Senator Becca Balint. She's from Brattleboro. She's in Montpelier right now. I don't know that we're going to see it here, but you'll be able to see it on one of these monitors. So if you would, Colin.
All right. Well, thank you so much for giving me a chance to comment. I'm Senator Becca Balint from Windham County, and
You're my senator. Sorry, I
I'm
interrupted.
your senator, exactly. I just want to say there are several strands of evidence that show that masks are effective in limiting the spread of disease. And the first type of evidence comes from lab studies of respiratory droplets, so spit, basically, and the ability of various masks to block those droplets. And an experiment from the National Institutes of Health used high-speed video to show what happens when someone speaks or yells through a piece of fabric. And hundreds of droplets in these videos, ranging from the tiniest little 20 micrometers to 500 micrometers, they were generated when people talked and when they yelled or said a simple phrase. And nearly all of those tiny droplets of spit were blocked when the mouth was covered by the cloth. Another study of people who had the flu or a common cold found that wearing a surgical mask significantly reduced the amount of these respiratory viruses that were emitted through their droplets, or what we call the aerosol in our spit. So, you can look at studies, but you can also look at the best evidence that we have that comes from real world situations. So a recent study published in Health Affairs compared the COVID-19 growth rate before and after masks were mandated in 15 states and the District of Columbia. And the evidence was completely clear. Mask mandates led to a slowdown in daily COVID-19 growth rate. So another study looked at coronavirus deaths across 198 counties in the United States and found that those with policies that supported mask wearing had lower death rates. And I'll give you two more compelling examples because I find these to be ones that the average person on the street can really understand. Okay, the first was a man who they tracked flying from China to Toronto, on a packed plane. And he had afterwards tested positive for COVID-19. So they knew when he landed that he had COVID-19. And he had a cough on the plane. They interviewed the folks. He was wearing a mask on the flight. And all 25 people sitting closest to him tested negative for COVID-19 exposure after the flight. In another instance, in late May of 2020, we know that two hairstylists in Missouri had close contact with 140 clients, cutting their hair, styling their hair while they were sick with COVID-19. But they wore a mask, and everyone who came into the shop wore a mask, and none of their clients tested positive, not a single one. So we do know masks protect the people around someone who's infected with COVID-19. We know this absolutely. I support encouraging Vermonters to wear masks. I know it is something that we can all do for our community members, for our neighbors and our families to help reduce the spread of this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, you did not have any advance warning on what she was going to say. What's your immediate response?
Well, there's a lot there. I think, for one, the idea of does a mask block droplets in a lab setting? Absolutely. I don't think you can refute that. There's also videos of people, and she made a bit of a mistake there, kind of conflating droplets with aerosols. But aerosols are the things that are really tiny. And I'm not a scientist, neither is Becca Ballant. But just from my understanding as a layman, aerosols are what are much, much smaller than actual water droplets. And if you were to vaporize a cigarette or whatever people vaporize and put a mask on and then exhale, what's coming out is the aerosol, and that comes right through. And viruses are consider a mask a chain link fence, and you can consider the virus particle a mosquito, right? So are you stopping the big water droplets that might carry some virus particles? Absolutely. But if you were to think you were protected from the mosquitoes because you had a chain link fence around you, it doesn't really account for what happens in the real world. She did cite some studies that I'm not familiar with. I don't know what could have been confounding those studies, which I think brings us into two things that I think are the interesting things to talk about, which is everyone's focusing on the masks here. That was kind of Article 1 of my letter. But Article 2 is the PCR tests being enormously unreliable, high false positive rates.
Now, what are PCR tests?
Polymerase chain reaction tests are the the lion's share of how we've conducted testing for COVID-19. And what they basically do is you take a swab from somebody, and then the PCR test was developed by a guy named Kary Mullis, who won the Pulitzer Prize for, or sorry, the Nobel Prize in chemistry for it. And it's a procedure developed to manufacture higher volumes of whatever's there. So it's basically something he said should never be used for diagnostics, interestingly enough, because it blows up everything exponentially. So it's an exponential process, and when you have a little bit of something, it can make it seem that there's much, much more. And every time you cycle, it doubles what is there, right? That's what happens in an exponential process. And when you, the Journal of Clinical Infectious Diseases study shows that when you double it enough, they took 3,000 samples of people who tested positive for a PCR test, and 97% of those samples that tested positive for COVID-19 on a PCR test didn't have enough virus in it when they actually took that sample and said, well, it tested positive, let's see if there's an actual virus in it when we culture it. 97% did not at 35 cycles. And that, to my understanding, is the common cycle threshold that has been used up until now all across Europe and the United States. When you scale that back down to a more appropriate cycle threshold, around 25 doublings of whatever was in that swab, it says it's more like 75% accurate. So 75% of those swabs actually had enough virus in it to make someone sick. So this really gets to the bigger point of like, what can we trust about any of those numbers? What can we trust if Carolyn Partridge's son-in-law actually had COVID-19, right? If it was simply a matter of a test that had a 97% false positive, right? Like, we really can't rely on that. And if either of these is true, then masks are unnecessary, right? If either the masks aren't protecting us all that much, or the threat is being completely taken out of scale because the data we're basing it on is completely out of scale, then masks are unnecessary. So I think that's my larger response. I don't even remember all the points she made. It was kind of a lot there to talk about.
Well, on the topic of the PCR tests, basically giving lots of false positives, or not necessarily, there's no demonstrated correlation between a positive test and a possible fatality. I saw a meme early on in the pandemic that it was the most hilarious thing I'd seen in a while. It was like a faux newspaper headline, and it said, "Man attacked by great white shark dies of COVID-19." So there was, and I wish I had the exact statistics to hand, but there was a cruise ship that was forced to stay in port in Japan, and there was something on the order of like 2,700 passengers on it, and then they discovered that the way that the air circulates through the cruise ship, they wouldn't let anybody off because they didn't want to infect, the general population. But the cruise ship itself, and even though they had confined everybody to their cabins, the circulatory system in the cruise ship was basically ideal for making sure that every single person on board was exposed. And of a couple thousand people plus who were old, and think about who goes on cruises. It's old people, right? I mean, who's got the time and the money to go on cruises? 14 people died. So, no, actually 14 people, I think, contracted it, and fewer died. But the total death rate was minuscule at, amongst a population who we know is exposed at length and who were in a high risk category. So I don't know what the actual fatality rate for this thing is, but I don't believe anybody right now.
That's a huge problem.
I don't believe anybody. So I know that some people will want to minimize it, and other people will want to greatly exaggerate it, both for political reasons. And I think that, and we talk about climate change in this respect as well. I think science in general, it's a self-correcting methodology over the long haul, But in the short term, it is susceptible to political pressures, funding pressures, social pressures. We are a very divided country right now. There's the red tribe and the blue tribe, and never the twain shall, say a kind word to or about one another. And so, in the moment, I'm, a pathological level agnostic, and that I just don't, other sources of information that I used to consider credible, I now look at askance.
Can you give me an example of one of those?
Well, the big one for me is NPR.
Yeah.
I was a lifelong NPR fanatic, and now I don't believe a thing. I mean, if they tell me the score of a baseball game or something, I'll believe it. But, it's stuff I don't care about. So let me read a few comments here from people watching the
I do
stream.
want to just respond one thing. I think
Okay,
Rebecca
go
Balin mentioned a couple examples of the guy on the plane not giving it to the people next to him.
Mhm.
I think that is a valid use case for masks. I think if you are symptomatic and actively coughing, it's a great idea to wear a mask. Now, does that follow that we should therefore mask all healthy individuals, symptomatic or not?
Right.
Especially if the prevalence of the disease is much less than we thought and the effectiveness of masks is less than we thought, then that's a big leap for me.
Do you see the video of the family who got kicked off a flight because their 2-year-old wouldn't keep her mask on?
Yeah, that's insane.
Yeah, that's absolutely insane. So in the chat here, Static Warp says Liam's laptop is acting up. This is actually the Fact TV the laptop here, but it's acting up because it wants you to wear a mask. So, Hikane says, do you think the legislators actually care about anything your letter said?
Oh, well, do I think they care about this issue? Yes. Do I think they would really listen to someone that doesn't have the qualifications to comment on this, even though I was citing people who did have the qualifications? No, ultimately I think legislators, just like all humans, are kind of committed to their social pressures and to their own biases, and someone else's viewpoint, no matter how good the evidence, wouldn't be good. I think I would have to be Tony Fauci. I couldn't come to somebody and say, this is what Tony Fauci said. It needs to come from the horse's mouth of the authorities. If you're
not just an expert, not just somebody with the technical knowledge, but somebody who is recognized like by the media and
Correct.
by mainstream figures in government as an expert.
Right.
Yeah. So 6 Sigma 6, I think this is talking about your energy work and also how it relates to our geopolitics and the American empire. And I'm not one to say the U.S. is an empire, therefore it is condemnatory. I mean, empires, they're called Pax whatever, Pax Romana, Pax Americana, because they do create wide spheres of order and safety for trade and other types of human interaction to take place in, without conflict, without violence. So I'm not an empire is bad kind of guy. But the U.S. is an empire. For those who deny that, I scratch my head at your definition of empire if the U.S. doesn't count. I mean, we don't have an emperor. We have a president.
Mm-hmm.
So in that respect, we are not a formal empire. But in any other respect, I mean, we certainly qualify. But 6 Sigma 6 says, a cup of gasoline, 8 ounces, is equal to a man's labor for a day or a little less than 2,000 calories. 31,000 calories per gallon. 3 working weeks per gallon. 2 cents per hour. I think basically that's an answer to the question of what were we doing in Iraq. Although I should say that the U.S. has not been heavily dependent on oil from that part of the world in a very long time. Most of our oil comes, I mean, before most of it is domestic now, but before the shale revolution, most of it, yes, was coming from Canada and Mexico, and for a time Venezuela, but we didn't really need that. Canada and Mexico supplied most of what we needed. And I think I'm channeling George Fried, an author whose book I just listened to, and his name's not coming to mind, but one reason why the U.S. still has an interest in Middle East oil, even though Middle East oil mostly just powers Asian countries, China, Japan, South Korea, is because if there is a shortage there, if the supply there is cut off, that affects prices worldwide. which will drive up prices for Americans. Even though we don't need that particular oil, it still makes oil more expensive.
Yeah, I mean, if you're interested in geopolitics, you want control over the spigot. Not that we necessarily got control over the spigot. I think it might, if you're going to talk about the geopolitical implications of why we might be involved in Iraq, it probably has more to do with the petrodollar than with the actual barrels of oil.
Say more about that.
So after World War II, the United States basically said the New World Order, Bretton Woods Conference, is based on the American dollar, and
which was based on gold.
Which was based on gold at the time.
Yeah.
And then that changed, but the American dollar basically keeps its dominance in the world. It's like the world's reserve currency in terms of trading oil. So if you're Greece and I'm Iran, and you come to me with your, I don't know, what do they have in Greece before?
Lira? Oh.
Maybe, let's just say it's the Greek dollar, and you come to me and I say, I can't take the Greek dollar to give you my oil. You have to go change that in for US dollars, because that is what the trading currency of oil is. Then that basically keeps demand for US dollars really strong, and that means it's a very valuable currency, and that's what helps Americans have huge purchasing power differentials in other countries, and that's very advantageous economically. And when countries want to, Libya and Gaddafi, Iraq and Saddam Hussein and Iran, when these countries want to break that monopoly of trading oil for dollars only, they're willing to accept other currencies, then America doesn't like that. That's bad news.
It's my understanding that China now buys oil from Russia in something other than dollars.
Well, I think China's powerful enough to do that, and Russia is not going to be invaded anytime soon.
So, Static Warp says, it is really frustrating to see anyone quoting data and studies as a way to justify the state response to COVID-19. A study would not hold up in a court of law, so why use it to make laws? Nice.
Interesting.
He also writes, data science is everywhere. More and more people know that if you get bad data, you will get bad results, and none of these studies is vetted before being used as a justification for anything.
Correct.
Synchronium24 writes, if you get bad data, you will get bad results. He's quoting Static Warp from the previous comment. That's true, but I wonder what your suggested alternative is. For me, studies are the least flawed method we have for ascertaining truth. And David Henry says, Peter Zion, and the answer is no. The person I was thinking of was Daniel Yergin. He's the author of a book called The New Map, and I don't have the full title to hand, but it's about energy and geopolitics. Ben writes, do either of you believe any claims of COVID-19 coming from a lab? My answer here is deceptive. No, I don't believe it came from a lab, but that doesn't mean I believe the opposite. I just don't have any opinion on that.
Yeah, I don't have a strong opinion about it. I do have a couple of references of people I consider credible who think it's highly likely. There was a doctor who did a Bayesian analysis that says he thinks it's like 98%. I forget his name, but he works in Taiwan, and it didn't seem like an terribly contrarian person in any other respect. Brett Weinstein and his wife, he's a evolutionary biologist who's known much more for other things, for being basically a political
for being chased off the Evergreen campus.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But he was a evolutionary biologist who studied bats, and he's come around to thinking it's almost certain it came from a lab. So I don't think it's. I mean, if I had to bet, I would say it probably did come from a lab. There's, I guess, some markers about just how a virus like that could have gained access to humans, as well as gained some like heightened, what they call that, chimeric, right? Like where they actually intend for functions like transmissibility to be heightened. It seemed like both of those things happened for this virus at the same time, or something like that. But anyway, there are credible people who I think think it's very likely, and I would at least consider that as a possibility.
Now, I'm certain that the United States and China and probably several other countries are doing research, military-based research to weaponize viruses.
Yeah.
I mean, who doesn't believe that?
Right. Which I think there's a whole community of people out there who think that the virus doesn't exist or hasn't been isolated yet, and I think what would explain the billions of dollars in military research? They don't just throw that money out the door. They actually like things that kill people. You know.
True that. So David says, wondering if that's the book KMO is referencing. So again, the book I was referencing is, I'm going to look up the full title for you. Liam jabber for a second while I call up this book. On the spot.
One of the things that I think gets missed in the conversation is the role of Tony Fauci. A lot of people point to him saying, "Oh, I was lying to get people to think they didn't need masks so that we could save them from save them for medical personnel." But that's not the issue I have. The issue I have is that no one else in the scientific community roasted Tony Fauci at the time. They never said, he's lying, what's he saying? It's because what he was saying at the time was consistent. And that I think is the point that easily gets lost. That there was a reason he said that, and the scientific community wasn't up in arms about it.
But when he then turned around and said, well, I was just saying that because we wanted to save all that, protective equipment for the medical professionals, there wasn't a wave of, other professionals saying, no, you were right the first time. I mean, I think people are just sort of sitting on their hands and keeping mum because, any misstep can cost you your career in the current climate. So the book is The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations by Daniel Yergin. And if you're an energy geek, this is a very, very fun book. He talks a lot about the history of natural gas exploration and drilling and, all the precursors to what in the early part of the 21st century turned into the shale revolution. And then looking at the geopolitical implications going forward. It's a cool book. And it's kind of funny because, I used to be into the peak oil scene. And back when I was really into it, like 2007, 2008, Daniel Yergin was a hated figure in that community because he was the one saying, no, this fracking thing really is going to scale up. They're going to get better at it. They're going to bring the prices down, and it's going to work out. And the peak oil people will say, nope. Peak oil happened in 2005, and from here on out, it's just, we're just going straight for Mad Max. And it didn't work out that way. Daniel Yergin was definitely vindicated by the last decade and a half of history. All right, and then back to, I've lost.
I guess I'd like to talk about the idea of what you do in a situation where there is a divide where, even if it was 1%, there seemed like between the legislators and a lot of people who also commented on this thread, that would be fine for them, right? Like any sort of logic just gets countered with someone else's logic, and we're in this space where making sense of the world and creating policy from that sense-making process is effectively broken. And people are defaulting to things that are not logic, or and for good reason in some ways, because the science can be incredibly politicized. It's just like, it's known, right? Science is not somehow this sanctimonious institution that doesn't,
Well, it is sanctimonious.
Okay, sure.
But not necessarily scrupulous about, never mixing in political and social pressures, and letting that color their results.
Right. So, like, how do you bridge a divide when people are entrenched in camps and not willing to really even hear each other? And I feel like that's where we're at, and I'm at a loss.
Well, that's a big question, and probably like one of the most important ones that we're looking at right now is we're so polarized. How can we talk to each other? How can we talk to each other and listen to one another? And a frustration of mine is that, I've been a libertarian for a good part of my life, which is, in the U.S. that's considered a right-wing position. But most of the people that I hung out with and, enjoyed their company, they were more in the blue tribe. And now I see people who are becoming disenfranchised from the blue tribe. Either they hate the wokesterism or they've been a victim of it. and they look around, for somebody who's saying something that they can connect with, and it's like what used to be called the alt-right. It's the new young right-wing folk, and people who really don't have a whole lot in common with that worldview because they got shamed somewhere, because they got fired because they said something bad, because they got kicked off of Twitter. They look around for some new port in a storm, and that's where they go. I mean, it's really uncomfortable to not be in one of the two big tribes.
Yeah.
And I'm not. I'm dedicated gray tribe still. But I understand that it's
spot.
an uncomfortable place to be.
Yeah, I'm sure you could see by some of the conversation that ensued that I kind of straddle a world.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of blue wokester vitriol, and there's a lot of people that seem to think along my lines, and it's definitely uncomfortable, but it's very interesting to try and be agnostic, as best as I can.
Or unaligned, unaffiliated. Yeah. I'm frustrated with the tactics of the woke crew, but I've also resolved not to obsess over it. Like the Republican, particularly in Washington, D.C., the Republicans are definitely obsessing over it because policy-wise, they don't really have anything with which to appeal to non-billionaires. Both the red and the blue tribe in Washington serve Silicon Valley and the defense industry and the pharmaceutical industry and the fossil fuel industry, and the middle class is in free fall, and neither one of the major parties has any intention of doing anything about that. So, and it's really bad. And from the red tribe right now, they just obsess over Dr. Seuss or whatever the outrage of the left is du jour, and I'm resolved not to feed that beast. How are we doing, Colin? Hikane. 3 minutes. All right. So we're bringing it in for a landing here. What's the major takeaways you think we should emphasize?
I think we should be less afraid.
Fear is the mind killer.
Yeah.
All right. That's a good one. I mean, we could just leave it at that, but there's another 2.5 minutes.
Oh, okay.
So.
Well, yeah. I would put it back to Becca Balint and Carolyn Partridge and all those legislators who responded that fair enough, they disagree with me on masks, and we could get into the war of study versus study, which is tedious.
Yeah.
Or I'll concede that, right? And let's talk about the PCR test, because if that is also true, then we have reason to believe that masks are unnecessary.
Will you be getting the vaccine when you're eligible?
No.
No. That's a whole nother conversation.
That's a whole other conversation.
So I just want to say one last thing before we go. Vermont has a very small population. I put this off. I sent invitations to come and participate either in person or by Zoom to 4 elected representatives this morning. 3 of them got back to me, and one of them arranged to do, a clip. She couldn't participate, long form, but she did participate by video over Zoom. And that's the nice thing about living in a small state.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. All right, everybody. I think we're out, but I'll be back drawing tomorrow, and I'll be back here in the studio a week from today. Thanks a lot.